Well, hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. My name's Adrian Gilbert, in case you've forgotten. And we're really pressing on now. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty. I think we've got something like 100 lectures up on YouTube at present, and we've got a lot more we're going to be doing. But right now we're getting into the whole subject area of Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, and particularly the work of J.G. Bennett. And we're going to be going into energies. I've done one lecture on this already, and this is the second part of that. And there will be another one to come in due course. So this is mainly intended for members of the Invisible College. That is those of you who are patrons. However, it is possible that sometime in the future this may be put on general release, but I think I'm probably going to keep these lectures specifically for the college. People haven't made any kind of commitment to themselves to wanting to take this work to the next level, which is that you start applying it, then really there's not much point in them just playing around with ideas of this sort. It's much more important for those who are already committed and want to make something of this. So anyway, no more ado, let's press on. This lecture is called Gurdjieff, Bennett and Grades of Energy, Part 2. And if you haven't seen Part 1 yet, then maybe you should watch that one first. It's on the listing on YouTube. And we're getting the new website up and running soon, so things will be easier to find then, I believe. Right, so I Gurdjieff is an Armenian-Greek from the borderlands of Russia and Turkey, and his pupil D Ouspensky, a Russian from Kharkiv. Yeah, with Kharkiv, that's been in the news a lot lately, hasn't it? Being attacked by Russia in what is now the Ukraine, were two of the most extraordinary thinkers of the first half of the 20th century, certainly in my opinion anyway. Gurdjieff founded a school, or as he called it, an academy, where students could learn both the theory and certain practical applications of methods for self-transformation. And he first taught this in Russia, but after the revolution, that's the Russian Revolution, transferred to Europe. So I think he first taught this in Moscow, and then he also had groups in St Petersburg, where Ouspensky lived most of the time. Then the two of them left. They went to, at the time of the revolution, 1919, they went to Georgia, to Tiflis, which these days is called Tbilisi. And I think they then went into eastern Turkey and made their way across to Istanbul. And that's where they met Bennett. And later they had schools of their own. We've talked about them before, their schools, which were in France and Britain mainly. So Ouspensky was the Plato to Gurdjieff's Socrates. He systematized and packaged Gurdjieff's ideas into a form that could be understood by later generations. This saved the Gurdjieff work from oblivion, but also condemned it to ossification. So I'll just say a couple of words here. With any teacher, I would classify Gurdjieff as one of the great teachers of humanity. With any teacher like this, teaching philosophy or practical philosophy, you get this danger that the work can either be lost entirely, because there's nobody to continue or do things with it, or you can get a situation where it's codified, put into books, and taught that way, and then later generations get the work, but they don't get necessarily the full meaning of it. And the books become very precious, and people don't want to change anything. And this certainly happened with Plato, for example. He wrote all the books about Socrates and the various dialogues of Socrates, which are the basis of Socratic philosophy. Socrates himself doesn't seem to have written anything. It was down to his pupil, Plato, to preserved for us what he had to say and what he taught. Maybe there's a bit of Platonic spin on this, I'm sure there is, but the basic ideas were Socratic. And we get the same thing with Gurdjieff. He was a great teacher. He did actually write things himself, but his writings, most of them, I'm thinking here particularly of a very long collection of 3 books he calls All and Everything, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, is written in such a weird way. It's a sort of science fiction novel in a way. He uses that format and threads in his teachings using strange words that you never heard of before, strange concepts. He did this deliberately because he wanted to short circuit people's brains from just making random connections with things they've already read and not really thinking about what they're reading. But it does make it very, very difficult to unravel what Gurdjieff himself was wanting to actually teach us. Whereas Ouspensky, his pupil, systematized everything, put it into a much more methodical format, almost like a textbook format, so that you could study ideas one after another and get a much better understanding from that perspective. But unfortunately, it lost a lot of the feeling and a lot of the energy that Gurdjieff was imparting. And you get, I think, a sort of imbalanced view of this whole idea of the work that Gurdjieff was teaching. So that's kind of where things were left around 1950 when Ouspensky died, and his great book In Search of the Miraculous was first published shortly after that. But there were schools gathered together, different groups that had been formed in different countries. Gurdjieff himself had been in France, so his schools are mostly there, direct schools, I should say. Ouspensky had been in London, so his schools were mainly in London, but also they both had satellite schools in America, and in due course there were other satellites in South America. I'm particularly thinking of Ouspensky's student Rodney Collin, who went out to, I think, Mexico, and he taught there, and those ideas spread through that connection into South America. And there are also other groups in Germany and Russia. But anyway, this is what tends to happen with schools, that you get someone who's inspired, like Gurdjieff, who was obviously a highly developed man himself, certainly in certain aspects. I think other aspects of him were perhaps less developed than we might like. But he certainly was a motivating force. There was something coming out of it, something new, a deep understanding. Ouspensky was more of the scientist, rationalist, the collector of ideas. He did have ideas of his own as well, don't get me wrong. He is a philosopher in his own right. But where Gurdjieff is concerned, he was more concerned with preserving so it wouldn't get lost, hanging on to it. Now, the third person that we're going to talk about is J.G. Bennett. And in the last lecture, we began an examination of the work of J.G. Bennett, who was one of the most famous pupils of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, at least in England, Britain he was. And he was with G on his last days. He rediscovered Gurdjieff, I should say, not long before he died, perhaps a year before. He'd been a student of Ouspensky before that. So he's with Gurdjieff on his last days and was one of the few people who could talk to him in his native languages of Russian, Turkish and Greek. He would later set up schools of his own where the G and O systems of ideas formed the core. However, unlike most of G's former students, he elaborated on the system with ideas of his own. For him, G's legacy was a starting point and not a final destination. So I think this is important as well. That Gurdjieff himself, before he died, he turned to his pupils and he said, well, I'm leaving it all to you. Think of it as being like very fine leather, and you could make yourself a very good pair of shoes if you so chose. other people thought, well, we just got to hang on to his ideas. The master's going, he's dying. We got to make sure we haven't lost anything. Bennett was more of the opinion that he needed to use his brain. He needed to take these ideas and work with them and find out more. And I think that is the right way to go on. So I first met him in 1973 and later found myself working for his publishers. Now, this is complete coincidence. When I applied for the job with these publishers, I had no idea that Bennett was one of their authors. I think it might have swung things in my direction to get the job when I was able to mention that I had met Bennett, because the publisher had been one of his students. But again, I didn't know that prior to that. I was there when his last book, published posthumously, was being prepared. Called Deeper Man, it was edited and organised from his notes by one of his own most senior students and indeed friend, Anthony Blake, another guy who's extremely clever. They worked together a lot on something called systematics, which was a very, very cerebral, deep perspective approach to the whole idea of computer programming, which back in the 1950s was in its infancy. And the book Systematics, about systems of thinking and how you would do what we would now, I guess, term AI, was something that they were working on, and they were using the Gurdjieff ideas to bring this together. Now, Deeper Man is a truly brilliant work in its own right. In it, Bennett presents some of his last and most interesting ideas concerning the framework of man, his consciousness, sense of identity and purpose. He links all this with his theory of energies, first given in his magnum opus, The Dramatic Universe, but presented in a more accessible way in a later, shorter work, Energies, Material, Vital and Cosmic. Now, just let's say a couple of words about The Dramatic Universe. That's a collection of 4 large books. I used to have a set, I don't anymore, but I've read it. Anyway, this was Bennett's own reply in many respects to Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales. It's a great volume or collection of volumes, very deep, hard to read. And Ouspensky's collective works. Bennett wanted to make his own mark, and he decided he was going to write about the entire world, the universe, everything: history, science, esoteric ideas. He packaged the whole lot into 4 great big volumes. He called this his whim. I mean, Gurdjieff said everyone should have a whim, and so he decided this was his whim. He was going to put the entire learning of the world and his own understandings of it into 4 volumes. Well, I don't know if he thought it was 4 volumes when he started out. Maybe it was like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, a trilogy in 4 parts. I don't know. But anyway, very, very dense. He invents new words, he invents new concepts, he presents ideas very philosophically. And I think in a way that was him getting all that off his chest. That's how I view those books. I think, got all that off my chest. And then he wrote other books which are actually far more interesting, I think, and better written, mostly taken from lectures that he gave. And this one on energies, which takes the ideas that he had written about in Dramatic Universe, but puts them into a much more accessible format. And he revisits that whole subject area in Deeper Man, along with other things. And as I say, A.G. Blake did a wonderful job of pulling together Bennett's notes. He was going to write this book, but he died before he could. Putting it all together, warts and all, and publishing it. And he goes into the energies thing in an even better way, I think, in Deeper Man. So those are the books that are the inspiration for what we're looking at now. In this lecture, we're going to examine some of his key ideas concerning energies. However, if you would like to learn more about these ideas, then both books are highly recommended, and I mean that. If you can, try to read these books. You can get them on Kindle as well as, I think Deeper Man's quite hard to get hold of now, in hardback anyway. Energies, yeah, you can get hold of that. But both are available on Kindle, and I do recommend that you read the actual books themselves, as well as what I'm telling you, because I'm going to add my own spin as we go along as well, as I should do. So in the last lecture, I presented this diagram which summarizes much of what Bennett has to say on the subject of energies, and you maybe recognize this. He divides them into 12 categories, which he labels with E numbers from 1 to 12. That's E for energy. Philosophical transformation is a process of taking one energy and turning it into another. You can call that alchemy in another sense. Philosophical alchemy is about this, but that's another subject, and I don't want to confuse what we're doing here by going into that framework. So in the case of dispersed energy, E12, you can see I've ringed that in red at the bottom there. This means transforming it, or at least some of it, into directive energy, E11, that's the energy above, immediately above. To do this requires an apparatus. Now that's a word that Gurdjieff himself liked to use a lot, apparatus. He talks about apparatuses for this, apparatuses for that. Should I be saying apparati for this, apparati for that? But anyway, the idea is that when you want to transform something, you're probably going to need, almost certainly will need an apparatus, unless nature itself is your apparatus, as it often is. And I mean, for example, I've got a camera trained on me. It's taking the light that I'm projecting, being reflected off me. And there's a microphone connected to the system that's collecting my words. And these apparatuses are pulling things together and recording this lecture. The apparatus is actually able to time shift what I'm doing here into a format where you will be able to watch the lecture at leisure by using another apparatus, which is your computer, maybe your handheld phone, maybe a tablet or something, taking it off the internet. These are all apparatuses, and each time these are being used, this energy is being transformed from one form to another to bring my words, as I say, time shifted from when I record things to when you want to actually watch the lecture. So everything is involved with apparati of one sort or another, but you do need them for these transformations of energy. But first, what is energy? It comes as a bit of a shock when we realize that we don't really know. Furthermore, we cannot see it. What we can do is transform it with an appropriate apparatus. In doing so, we are able to observe its activity and sometimes make quantitative measurements. The steam engine mallard, we've met this before in the last lecture, is such an apparatus. We don't often talk about a steam engine using the word apparatus, but that's exactly what it is. It enables us to convert some of the heat energy that is released by burning coal into directional energy. This can then be used to move a train along a track, in other words, in a direction. In other words, to do useful work. As I discussed this at length in the previous lecture, I shall say no more here. So this apparatus takes the randomized energy of heat generated by burning coal, and it turns some of it, most of it is lost actually, or not useful, and it uses that to move that energy, and the coaches that it's pulling, or the trucks or whatever it's pulling, along a track in a directional way. So it's taking that random heat energy and vectorizing it. A vector is movement with a certain direction. Now, before we go any further, it's important to remember that in all cases we don't know what energy actually is. We can only observe its transformations, such as in an atomic explosion. And I want to make that point, that we really don't know what energy is. You say, well, I know what energy is. I know this, that, and the other. No, I mean, you might feel energetic one day and flat as a flat battery the next. You know that there is something you might call energy that is responsible for that, but you don't know exactly what the energy is. And it's the same with all energies. We recognize energy by its transformation. If I hold up this pen here, there's an energy stored in that which is released when I drop the pen. Now, I can't see the energy. I can't really understand it. I just know it's there, and we can make equations. We understand there's this concept we call gravity that attracts things downwards towards the center of a larger mass. Isaac Newton worked that out, but we still have no idea what gravity is. I want to make that point. We just know what it does, and we know we can work out equations about that. We can work out how things are going to fall. We can design big howitzers. We can work out exactly the right angle that they should be fired at to make our shell land on the enemy tanks that we're trying to shell. You can do that if you understand the laws of physics, and gravity is one of those aspects of that. You also need to know the dynamics of movement, of motion, and how things are affected, and how your shell goes up and then it follows a parabolic curve and comes down. You need to know all those sorts of things, but that can be done, and probably done quickly with a computer these days. But we don't know what the gravity itself is. We just know there's an attracting force, or it seems to be an attracting force, that pulls things towards the center of a mass. Why it does that, we don't know. Nevertheless, these observations are important. The law of conservation of energy states that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It is simply transformed. An atomic explosion is simply the transformation of energy stored in the nuclei of atoms. We can therefore use mathematical equations to predict the amount of energy that is stored in a given amount of uranium. So that's another point. There's the conservation of energy. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. This is the fundamental basis of all science. I wonder if you realize that we could not actively follow science if we thought that we can just create fresh energy. We can just magically make it happen. Now, no, I won't go down that road because it's a bit of a diversion, but unfortunately some modern scientists are trying to do just that. They're trying to make inventions of things, of energies that we can't see, we can't measure, we can't look at, we can't do anything. We just have to assume they're there to make the equations work. And that is a fallacy in scientific terms. So the study of energies is really about the study of transformation from one thing to another. And if you can begin to understand that, then you can begin to get a handle on the idea of human transformation and how we can transform ourselves or transform our being to be able to progress to get off this planet, which is what this is really all about. So let's carry on. Science is mostly concerned with such measurements, and they are crucial to development of all technologies. That's the measurements of energies and what's contained in, for example, uranium, and what can be released either for peaceful purposes in a uranium in an atomic reactor to make electricity, another form of transformation, of course, or violently in warfare with atomic bombs, which we hope nobody's ever going to use again. It is important to remember that nothing tangible is actually extracted from rocket fuel. Yes, you're not extracting anything, and it's not like you're making whiskey and you boil your base brew, whatever it is, and you extract the fumes and get the alcohol from that. It's not like that. What you're extracting is intangible. A mixture of oxygen and kerosene is burnt up and thereby generates exhaust gases, water vapor, and sound waves and heat. Some of this energy, E12, right, that's the heat energy, is transformed into directed energy of motion of the rocket. So it's getting some E11. In this sense, a rocket engine is little different from a steam engine. At root, both are thermodynamic heat engines. So I want to make this point. That mallard that we were looking at, that locomotive, is actually a similar kind of apparatus to a rocket. It doesn't look like it when you look at it, from the outside. You think of a rocket and a steam engine, but basically they are apparatuses of the same sort. They convert heat energy, or some of it, into directed energy, and that they're both apparatuses doing that job. Extraordinary. So returning to Bennett's table of energies, we see that he first divides these into two categories, objective and subjective. So we got the objective there, it's written vertically at the far right side there, and above the red line we got subjective, and that red line divides the two. So the objective energies are these lower ones, going from E12 up to E7. So the objective energies, as the name would suggest, are those which can be studied objectively. You can't study the energy itself, but you can study its transformations, and you can study the apparatuses that those transformations take place in, and you can make quantitative assessments from that. You're looking at it from an external point of view. So far, we've only considered the transformations of heat into directed motion. This involves the two lowest energies, E12, dispersed heat, and E11, directive vectored motion. The branch of physics dealing with these transformations is called thermodynamics. It is well understood, having been studied and developed over centuries. Thermos is Greek, means heat. Dynamics comes from dynamos, which means movement or motion, work. So it's the work and the movement and motion derived from heat. The next energy is E10, which Bennett calls cohesive. This he describes as the binding energies that hold things together. On the one hand, these are chemical energies that bind atoms together to make molecules and molecules to make objects. On the other, the energies that result in surfaces, for example, surface tension. He writes, "These energies are at the very basis of the structure of matter as we know it, for they give solids and liquids their cohesion. There are energies on the surface of bodies by which they are maintained, and which exert an attraction when they are brought together, so that bodies can be coalesced." He goes on, "In liquids, this surface energy produces the properties of surface tension. What we experience through our senses is largely the forms that are produced through the cohesive energies. They give a pattern to matter. We can see this very clearly in crystals, where the lattice energies establish a very definite three-dimensional form." And we got a picture there of those are actually crystals of sulfur. A sulfur can take various different forms, but one of those is this crystalline form. The cohesive energies are really responsible for producing the familiar world of surfaces and volumes of solids and liquids. That's taken from Deeper Man. The next energy is E9. So we're moving up the table now, which Bennett calls plastic energy. This energy enables objects to be deformed without breaking. An example would be a rubber band or indeed a piece of plastic. Yeah, we call it plastic. Whereas the cohesive energies enable the formation of crystals, the plastic energy allows things to bend and to deform. Now, the first plastics they had, the thermoplastics like Bakelite, they could only be used, they had a mould and they'd squirt this stuff in and it would take the shape of the mould and then it would harden into a structure which couldn't then be melted again. They called it plastic because the stuff that was squirted in was plastic. Later plastics like polythene retain some of their plasticity. They mould and they bend. You can twist them and they spring back to their shape, like a plastic bucket, for example. And our world has been transformed by the use of plastic. We have got problems of recycling plastic and the build-up of waste material that's happened, and we need to learn to be more economical in our use of plastic. But there's no doubt in doubting that it's been a very, very important discovery, and that's making use of plastic energy, plasticity. Our bodies would be useless if our skin and muscle did not have the facility to bend without breaking. The same is true of the plant and indeed of all the living world, plants and all the living world. Plasticity is a property that is different from cohesion. So cohesion gives solidity, in its ultimate form, the solidity of crystals. Bennett writes, that things can change their shape and yet remain what they are is one of the highest properties that we can associate with a thing. It ought to be familiar enough to us through technology, where we work with materials, bending, stretching, flattening, twisting, compressing, and so on. And I've put this little image of the discus thrower, he couldn't begin to do any of that if he didn't have a very mobile plastic body that he can twist himself round like that and throw the discus. The plastic energy is the most free, the most versatile, and the most active of all the material energies. It is through discovering its power that we've been able to make such an impact upon our environment. And I guess he's talking here about plastics. But we use plastic energy in other ways too. Things that mould and shape and bend. I guess everything like a longbow would be using plastic energy. Catapult. All sorts of things that you might not think of initially are using plastic energy. And as I said, a rubber band or a car tyre, they predate plastics. Now, I would attribute the strange power of Uri Geller to bend a spoon by simply stretching them. It's the use of plastic energy. Now, hang on, I think I've got to put one over here. Yes. Now, this is a spoon that Uri Geller bent for me. And, well, I'll tell you a bit more as we go on. I have personally witnessed this as he once bent a spoon for me when I visited him in his house. He did not, as you might imagine, simply bend the spoon by muscle power. It was more like he injected a melting force into it that gave the spoon plasticity. We would normally do this by heating. When he handed me the spoon, it was still hot and still bending under the force of gravity. So here's the spoon. Now, when he handed this to me, it was like a plastic spoon that had been put in hot water. It was still mobile around this point here, and it felt hot to the touch. Now, he had not been doing this with the spoon, as you might imagine. All he had been doing, and I had been watching him and stroking it, it seemed like something was going out of his fingers into the spoon. Now, how he's got this power, I don't know. I guess we've all got plastic energy. We must have, or we wouldn't be supple and able to move around. Somehow he seemed to have an excess of this, and he could use that to make things happen. He's got other powers too, of telepathy and things like that. But this is what made him famous, was bending spoons and forks and all sorts of other things. And as I say, I've actually was watching him do this, and he actually signed the spoon for me to prove that it was one that he had done. So that, I think, is an example of plastic energy in action and should not be discounted. It's easy enough to say, well, it's a fake, he just did this, he must have done, you weren't watching properly, he was doing that. No, I was watching, I was like a hawk, and I was right next to him. I wasn't back in an audience 100 rows back. I was right there, and it did somehow, he seemed to be able to put energy into this spoon that made it hot and plasticized the metal in some way. Extraordinary. What he injected into the spoon must have been a plastic energy. In other words, an energy that made the spoon behave like a plastic spoon that had been put into boiling water. More than that, I can't say. Strange man, certainly. Strange powers, yes, definitely, I think. Other people say, well, he's just a showman, he's a cheat, he's a fraud, all that sort of thing. I don't think so. It's interesting to note that while children are usually very flexible, as we get older, we stiffen up. We think of this as a normal part of the aging process. However, maybe it is really a sign that we're deficient in plastic energy. Have you thought about that? That the stiffness of old age is perhaps due to a lack or deficiency in plastic energy. Exercises such as yoga, Zumba, Pilates, Tai Chi and so on bring attention to parts of our body. Perhaps one of the benefits of these exercises is that they help us transform some of our E10, the cohesive energy, into E9, the plastic energy. I'll just put that to you as a theory. Those who keep active stay active. The aging process, everything from mobility issues to Alzheimer's, is mainly due to energy deficiencies of one sort or another. We need to understand this and take action now while we still can. Let's say a couple of words on this. There's a big worry in our time about the Alzheimer's and the way it's more and more people are getting it, and they're often getting it at a younger age as well. And the scientists look at, they slice up brains and they say, well, there's this molecules are building up, or there's some kind of stuff that needs to be processed out. The dendrons are not working properly, etc., etc. I would say that actually the real problem is a lack of the right energy, the appropriate energy. It's not necessarily plastic energy we're talking about with the Alzheimer's. I think it's probably more to do with vital energy, actually. But there is a deficiency of energy of some sort, and if you could only get more of that energy, then it could be reversed, certainly if it's still in its early stages. And the same with the mobility issues. As long as we start working on ourselves to keep a bit more subtle, people who go for walks, for example, people who do yoga, people who do all sorts of different techniques, Swedish gymnastics. I know a lot of Christians hate the word yoga. They say, oh yeah, that's devil worship. It's not. Not the sort of yoga that's taught, in yoga classes, hatha yoga. I mean, it's all about stretching the body and working different muscle groups. You don't have to be worshipping Shiva to want your body to be in good shape. You could still be worshipping Jesus Christ, and God, the one God. You don't need to have elephant gods in your bedroom to be doing yoga. So I think that we need to get over that and take from other cultures, if they have something of use like that, techniques for working on the body and working with certain kinds of subtle energies, don't let's turn our noses up at them and go like this, it's stupid. So I think if we actually worked on the body more, and I'm guilty as everyone on this, I do try, but I'm not a number 1 type man, I'm a number 3 or 4 type man. I'm more up here and into the intuition side of things than the physical, but I do try. And if we would only do that more while we're still young, well, I'm 73 almost. I consider myself young though. And if we would do that, we could stay in better shape and we can overcome a lot of these problems, or we won't encounter them because we will have enough of the right energies to for our bodies to adjust and keep going, at least better anyway. So let's carry on. The plastic energy is the last of the so-called material energies. Right, so you can see that bracketed there, I've got material energies. The next group of 4 are the living energies. They are different from the material energies in that we are aware of them. So we have some kind of awareness of the living energies, more with some of them than others, but we certainly have some awareness and some control over them. Bennett writes, the living energies are of direct concern to us, not only because they bring with them life, but also because they include energies that cross the threshold of awareness. Life is a state of affairs that is connected with bodies, and every form of life that we know is the life of some living body. If there is something or other that has experience which is not connected with bodies, we can say straight away that it is beyond life. In other words, he's talking, I think, about souls or spirits, angels. They're beyond life. Every living body, even the very simplest, like a bacterium, let's say, has an immensely complex organization, far beyond anything that is not alive. So the first of the living energies is E8, or constructive energy. This and the next energy, E7, still lie within the objective sphere, which means it is open to scientific observation. Right? So we've got, below that red line, we've got the constructive and the vital energy, E8 and E7. And they belong to living, as opposed to just material, in that bracket. And Bennett equates constructive energy with the ability of living things to feed on their environment. He writes, the transition from the merely material to the living form is in the power to maintain a body at a higher level than that of its environment. Now that's a very interesting observation. I'll come back to that. In other words, living things are able to construct, grow and maintain a body that is at a higher level of complexity and being than the environment in which they exist. They are able to oppose the decaying process that reduces complexity. By this means, they resist the ashes to ashes processes leading in time to disorder and entropy. So I want you to think about this. Your body is able to maintain itself in this highly complex structure, all sorts of processes going on inside it, organs and blood flows and air coming in, etc. This organism. And you would think that by the ordinary processes of entropy means disorder, and things tend to break down, things tend to wear out. Yeah? You buy a new washing machine, give it a few years, the damn thing wears out, and you have to get another one. Your body has this means of maintaining itself and repairing and constantly renewing itself. And this is something that material energies, the basic material energies, don't have the ability to do this. It's something higher. And it enables us to maintain these incredibly complex structures, everything from a starfish to a whale to from a bug to a human being, the life on this planet is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary because it's got living energies working through it. And those living energies enable this complexity to manifest on Earth that would not be there otherwise. Because the ordinary law of entropy is that everything runs down. It's like a clock that's running out of steam, running out of clockwork. You have to wind it up. Well, who does the winding up? And this is the whole problem, you know. Unfortunately, our science is so attached to the decaying processes that it can't see that the sun itself is a living being. It's not just a big atomic explosion that's going to run out of steam and blow up and go cold or whatever. That's nonsense. When we get into the electric universe ideas, you'll understand that better. But unfortunately, our science is so wedded to material energies, it can't see above that. It doesn't believe anything above that. We need to break free from that and understand that life and life energies are something different, something higher. The constructive energy is closely linked with the DNA system of coding for all life forms. The DNA double helix contains the equivalent of a vastly complex computer code. Now, we've done some of that, and I did my revolution and evolution lectures, and if you haven't watched those, I do recommend that you do. Quite important ideas in those that will help you to understand what we're talking about here. Cells are able to use this to produce all manner of enzymes, hormones, RNA, amino acids, and much else besides. Then also enable cells to duplicate themselves and thus to grow new tissue. So our DNA is a massive computer code. And if anyone tells you that this just came about by chance, that the odd bug was walking around and he went out in the sunlight and the beam of light just happened to change his DNA a slightly bit, and then that happened again for something else and something else and something else over millions of years, and suddenly there we are. They're ignorant, they're idiots. Life energy, there are higher energies than this as well, are able to program. I was a computer programmer, and I can tell you that to write even a simple program requires thought. It requires some kind of structured energy to create something structured. You don't build a new car like a Tesla, let's say, by simply going out, getting some metal and banging it together and saying, well, that doesn't work, I'll just do it again. You actually have blueprints. You actually work on the blueprints. You design things. And then when you try it out and that model's not working too well, so then you change the blueprint. You change the coding to make it better. So there has to be intelligence involved. But anyway, I've talked a lot about that in the revolution and evolution lectures, so I won't go into that here. But anyway, our DNA lets us do all those things, including duplicating cells, so we can grow new tissue. According to Bennett, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is a carrier of constructive energy, and it is the basic genetic material. We also see examples of the constructive energy in biologically potent substances, such as enzymes, which are able to act on the non-living world in order to break things down, build them up. Chlorophyll is another example. More problematic for us are viruses. Though not actually alive in themselves, they have the ability to hijack cells and use them to carry out a pattern of behavior which is against the interests of the host they are infecting. Yes, aren't they just? Because they are carriers of constructive energy, viruses are able to insert coding of their own into the machinery of a cell. The cell will then produce duplicates of the virus instead of fulfilling its own functions, such as cell replication or manufacture of needed enzymes, etc. Just before we leave that, you can see that viruses also seem to have required some kind of intelligence to have produced them. And we know actually, I mean, this whole idea of the Wuhan lab and them playing around with viruses and changing their coding. Well, maybe there is a lab somewhere where there's some devil or something who's got it in for the human race and said, let's cook up another nasty virus and make them all ill. Get over their defenses. It's like that. It's a warfare. And one wonders where that's coming from. But that's a whole other subject too, isn't it? The next energy, the second of the living energies, is E7, or vital energy. This is the last of the objective energies which we can view, as it were, from the outside. Bennett refers to this as the directed energy of life. He writes, there is a certain similarity between each of the three groups of energies, and the vital energy gives to living things their characteristic outward directed, goal-seeking qualities. We can call it the urge to live, but has nothing to do with a state of awareness and pervades all of life. Whereas the constructive energy allows things to live, the vital energy drives them to live. We can say that the vital energy is life itself. So life force, the vital energy. But when people such as athletes are very fit, we say they are full of vitality. In other words, they have a lot of vital energy at their disposal. Generally speaking, younger people have more of this energy than older people who tire more easily. Well, we know they've got more vitality, haven't they? This energy also enables us to set and achieve goals, to heal more quickly from injury, and to generally feel well. It can also be transferred to others, as in hands-on healing. Jesus did a lot of this in his ministry and tells us how he could feel energy going out from him when he did so. I believe there's, don't ask me the chapter and verse, but there's one of the stories when he's walking through a crowd and a woman who has an issue of blood touches the hem of his garment because she's so desperate for healing. And he feels the energy going out of him, and he turns around and says, someone touched me, I know, because I felt the energy going out. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, sir. Anyway, he heals her, but he acknowledges that when he does his healing, that he feels something going out, an energy transfer. And she is healed by that. And so that's one way of healing. But I've written here, generally speaking, it is unwise to do this kind of healing unless you are connected to a much higher source. If you do, and you are not so connected, you will likely deplete your own vital reserve. Now, I want to give you a few words of caution here. A lot of people go in for what they call Reiki, and I've encountered this Reiki, and the idea is that they're tuning in on, I don't know, some kind of force that in Japan or Tibet or wherever it is, and they're laying hands on and they're healing the other person. But unless you really are connected to a higher level of energy, and I'm quite prepared to bet that 99.999% of these people are not, then what you're healing with is your own energy that you produce from food, from breathing air, from impressions, as we talked about elsewhere. And if you do this kind of healing, what you're going to do is you're going to give away your energy into this person. And you might think, well, that's a wonderful charitable thing to do. But unless you know how to replace that energy, for example, you are doing the right breathing exercises and the yoga and the rest of it to bring more energy into yourself. And Jesus talks about fasting as a means of building up energy. And he would instruct his disciples sometimes to go and fast before they try to cast out devils, for example. Unless you're prepared to do those kind of disciplines as well, you are going to do yourself serious damage. So I really don't recommend Reiki in particular to people. I think it's responsible for a lot of, probably half the time, maybe most of the time, they're not actually doing anything. But if they are, they're using their own energies to do it, and that's not a very wise thing to do unless you are a developed master. There really are vampires. They seldom look like Dracula or have a thirst for human blood. However, they do steal energy from others. Very often these are old or sick people who are no longer able to transform enough vital energy from the food they eat and the air they breathe. You will know if you've encountered a vampire because you feel tired and exhausted just by being in their presence. They may not even realize themselves that they're sucking the energy out of other people. If you do meet such a person, mentally cut the ties with them, say a prayer for protection, make your excuses if you need to, and get away. It goes without saying that vampires particularly like to get closer to children, as they are usually bursting with vitality. That's the children. So a lot of these, we hear these stories of child abuse, and yes, sometimes that is sexual abuse, obviously, but a lot of the time it is actually just an energy theft, that these people are desperate to get near to children so they can steal their vitality from them. And then you're stealing that child's future. You're stealing their energy that should be going for their growth, their development, their transformation, to prolong your own life. And I'm thinking here of certain, we hear rumours, don't we, about certain billionaires and people who are anxious to hang around with children. Well, this is what it's about. And I would caution you against this. If you come across people who are energy thieves of this sort, say a prayer and protect yourself, close yourself mentally, and make your excuses and leave, because you don't want to be caught up with them. That's different from showing compassion to old people and going to visit them in hospital or what have you. I'm talking about people who are real energy thieves, not just people who are just getting on a bit. When the body is no longer able to maintain itself with vital force, then it will die. According to Bennett, at death, when function ceases, the energy actually leaves the body and is then free to be absorbed into other living bodies. So the vital energy goes out of something when it dies. The person dies, or anything dies. This, I would suspect, is one of the main reasons why so many ancient cultures practiced animal and even human sacrifice. Released vital energy was frequently used to feed gods, really demons, who could then be expected to repay the favour. The accounts of the Spanish conquistadors concerning the visit of Cortes to the central temple of Tenochtitlan makes it abundantly clear that feeding demons was indeed the practice of the Aztecs. Thousands of people at a time would be sacrificed to these gods, really demons, their vital forces presumably being absorbed by them. Spanish called on the power of the Holy Trinity to exorcise these demons. Accordingly, the demons were thrown out and the Aztec Empire fell. Now, there's been a lot of demonic empires in the world, at different places at different times. A lot of this still goes on in certain parts of Africa and South America. And I'd caution you again, keep clear. We don't want to have anything to do with these kind of practices, which involve demons and demonic worship. The demons might then give the shamanic priest, or whatever he calls himself, clairvoyant guidance or help with something or other, or maybe in witchcraft to damage enemies, to put a hex on them or what have you. Keep well clear of all of this, and again, seek the protection of the Lord, seek the protection of Jesus Christ and the Trinity, and put up a shield to guard against such things if you should encounter them. And this brings us to the end of the objective energies, for although vital energy is intrinsic, we can still observe its workings and even quantify it. Our vital energy, or life force, is something we're all aware of, as it varies day by day and even hour by hour. It lies on the threshold of what we experience as ourselves and what we observe from outside. Crossing the red line will bring us to E6, the automatic energy, which, though still one of the living energies, is now within the subjective sphere. The higher energies take us away from the material world of objects into a different realm altogether. Accordingly, we'll discuss the subjective energies and how we experience them in the next lecture. So, I hope you enjoyed that, but I had to cut it short. I was originally going to do them all in one lecture, but we've obviously got far too much to say about just these first 6 energies. But the whole idea of energies, I think you're beginning to get an idea that the idea of transformation is right at the root of everything. Transforming one energy into another. Transforming heat into directed energy, and that into cohesive energy, and that into plastic, and so on up the chain. That's what we've been talking about with the man-machine and the Gurdjieff-Ouspensky ideas, and it's what is at the root of all such processes as yoga and the Tai Chi, the Chinese systems involving acupuncture meridians and so on. We'll talk about those in later lectures too. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to meeting again. Take care.